Many thanks for joining us, and here are business stories making headlines at this hour. I am Perpetua Fasomi Peter. Now the news in detail. Rising debt has pushed Nigeria up the World Bank's top 10 International Development Association borrowers list. The newly released World Bank fiscal year 2022 audited financial statements for IDA showed that Nigeria has moved to the 4th position on the list with $13 billion IDA debt stock as of June 30, 2022. This shows that Nigeria accumulated about $1.3 billion IDA debt within a fiscal year, with the country taking over the 4th top debtor position from Vietnam. The top 5 countries on the list slightly reduced their IDA debt stock except for Nigeria. India, which is still the first on the list, reduced its IDA debt stock from $22 billion in the previous fiscal year to $19.7 billion, followed by Bangladesh from $18.1 billion to $18 billion. It is also followed by Pakistan, which cut its debt from $16.4 billion to $15.8 billion. And lastly, Vietnam, which went down the list to 5th position from $14.1 billion to $12.9 billion. The World Bank disclosed recently that Nigeria's debt, which may be considered sustainable for now, is vulnerable and costly. However, the Washington-based global financial institution added that the country's debt was also at risk of becoming unsustainable in the event of macro-fiscal shocks. The bank further expressed concerns over the nation's cost of debt servicing, which, according to it, disrupted public investments and critical service delivery spending. And moving on, Nigeria's budget deficit has risen to at least 30.58 trillion naira in the last 7 years. An analysis of the report on the Budget Office of Nigeria's website revealed that Buhari's administration had spent at least 54.98 trillion naira on budget implementation since its inception, but has only financed this spending with 24.39 trillion naira, leaving a deficit of 30.58 trillion naira. Analyst Tajuddin Olayinka has condemned Nigeria's debt service to revenue, describing it as unsustainable. He said this while speaking on IBrandTV's flagship program, Business Breakfast. And speaking further, he emphasized the need for government to explore other means of revenue generation.
We should be worried because, if we have to look at it from different perspectives, we will see clearly that, everybody should be concerned about, the state of debt and the rising, budget deficit that, we've had over the past 7 years, of this current administration. Now, let's look at it from 3 different perspectives. The first perspective is that, at the first quarter of 2022, our debt stock was about 41.6 trillion naira. If we now consider the total, budget deficit for the last 7 years, we'll see clearly that gave us about 73.4%, which means that this government this current administration has been essentially on, a statutory budget, raising debt to finance its budget. So it means that if you have some 3.1% of debt stock as of today, you are only signing up debt for future generation or for administration that will succeed this particular administration. And the most important thing, like I mentioned earlier, is to drag more economic business or drag more people or more businesses into tax net. It's not just raising taxes; it's collecting taxes from where you're supposed to collect taxes. I mentioned earlier that Nigeria has a very huge informal sector. So with that, it's almost impossible to even collect tax, even when that sector is doing well. Basically, adding more to the output. It's difficult to collect taxes from them because you can't really see them. You only see them from the activities. You can't see them, it's not like you have something moving in the air, but you can't see that thing, but you can see that something is moving in the air. That's just the air. So we need to try and improve activities in the economy to encourage informal sector to come out and be part of the informal sector so that you can tax them. You also need, because what the CBN said and what other people, even IMF have said the same thing. Not only IMF, people World Bank said the same thing. And they are aware that our debt ratio is low. But revenue, debt service to revenue ratio is so high that nobody can call that one a sustainable revenue.
The Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG, is asking the Central Bank of Nigeria to address the challenge of multiple exchange rate windows to improve the inflow of foreign investments and diaspora remittances. The group said international investors, being savvy and rational, would not put their money where there was a real risk to their ability to access and repatriate investment proceeds or when the functional currency was in sporadic depreciation. Apart from the Nigerian Autonomous Foreign Exchange Rate Fixing (NAFEX) mechanism, where dollar exchanges 420 naira to 430 naira, the parallel market window sells at about 650 naira per dollar. Nigeria is also hard hit by revenue shortfalls, with revenue to GDP around 7%, among the lowest of the emerging markets. NESG said that Nigeria must take decisive action to tackle the government's revenue challenges, which could not be divorced from leakages through the large-scale crude oil theft, the difficult operating environment for businesses, and lack of innovation in tax collection and administration, among others. Nigeria's debt reached 41.6 trillion naira in the first quarter of 2022, with the country paying back creditors with 118% of revenue between January and April 2022. Still on economy, the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, has assured of its commitment to continue to fund 12 focal commodities that include cassava through its Commodity Development Initiative, CDI. The Director, Development and Finance Department, CBN, Mr. Yusuf Yila, committed during the inauguration of the first cassava-based sorbitol factory in Africa in Okeogun area of Oyo State. Yale, who was represented by the Deputy Director in the department, Edwin Zelu, said the initiative, introduced in 2019, is aimed at conserving foreign exchange through import reduction, boosting local production, thereby closing the existing supply gap of commodities with comparative advantage, as well as job and wealth creation, stating that it has enabled the bank to intervene across the value chain of several commodities from production to processing. According to him, Sultry was one of the beneficiaries of CBN CDI, noting that local production of cassava-based sorbitol would help to strengthen the naira, reduce unemployment and over-reliance on importation of the product, which is a natural sweetener extracted from glucose that drives agricultural revolution. She added that the company would create a pathway for aspiring entrepreneurs, aid financial institutions in how they can play important roles in the agricultural revolution, and how the nation can reduce its dependence on other countries for survival. The Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, LCCI, has urged the federal government to adopt measures that increase the country's revenue profile and borrow from cheaper sources to cushion the country's debt portfolio. Its president, Dr. Michael Olawale Cole, advised media advice in Lagos. He said it had become necessary because the country's rising debt stock was becoming increasingly problematic in the face of dwindling revenue and the unsustainable burden of subsidy payments. Olawale Cole noted that aggregate expenditure for the year was estimated at 17.32 trillion naira at the end of April. A revenue of 5.77 trillion naira was expected, but only 1.63 trillion naira was realized as the government's retained revenue. He added that within the same period, the government's actual spending stood at 4.72 trillion naira, 1.94 trillion naira on debt servicing, and 1.26 trillion naira on personnel costs, leaving only 773.63 billion naira for capital expenditure. He further said the country's total public debt stock rose from 39.56 trillion naira last December to 41.60 trillion naira by the end of the second quarter of 2022, as shown by the Debt Management Office, DMO. He warned that the borrowings were significant and that Nigeria was struggling to service these debts due to revenue mobilization challenges and an increased fuel subsidy burden. He said it was also imperative that more spending was needed in supporting productive infrastructure instead of spending borrowed money on subsidizing consumption.